The music center was always a noisy place in the evenings. Students came in with their bags, parents waited in the hallway, and different sounds from different instruments filled the air. But on this particular day, something felt a little different. Maybe it was the cold wind outside or the way the sky was turning orange, but the whole building felt quieter than usual. Inside the main practice hall, a man was already sitting at the large upright piano. His posture was confident, almost a little too confident, like he wanted everyone around to know he belonged there. He pressed the keys loudly, not because the piece needed that kind of energy, but because he liked hearing the sound echo across the room. It made him feel important. Anyone watching him could tell he wanted attention. Every few minutes, he looked around as if checking to see who was impressed by his playing. A few students politely listened for a moment, then went back to their own practice. The man didn't like that much. He wanted more eyes on him. He wanted the room to feel his presence. While he was busy in his world, the door opened quietly. A young woman stepped inside, carrying a simple, worn-out backpack over her shoulder. She didn't look like someone who came from a fancy music school. Her clothes were simple, her steps gentle, and she seemed a little unsure as she looked around the large hall. The man at the piano noticed her almost immediately. He stopped playing for a moment and raised an eyebrow, as if trying to figure out what she wanted. She didn't walk like someone who wanted attention. She didn't stand like someone who wanted to be noticed. She just looked around for an empty corner where she could wait without disturbing anyone. The man smirked to himself. She's definitely not a pianist, he thought. He had seen many people come to the music center. Most who knew how to play carried proper instrument bags or sheet music folders. But this girl had nothing except her old backpack. To him, that was enough proof she wasn't a musician. Maybe she was here to meet someone. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was just curious about the place. He made a quick, unfair judgment long before she even spoke. The girl sat quietly on a bench by the wall, her backpack resting beside her feet. She listened to the man play without interrupting. She didn't try to talk or ask for anything. She just waited, her eyes calm but observant, as if she was used to being patient. After a few minutes, the man glanced at her again. He noticed she kept looking at the piano, not in a showy way, but in a way that someone who truly loved music would look at an instrument. Still, he didn't believe she could play. In his mind, people who could play always looked a certain way, confident, bold, a little loud. She was the complete opposite. Finally, when he finished playing his piece, she stood up slowly and walked toward him. Her steps were soft, almost hesitant, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Would it be okay if I practiced after you?" Her voice was calm, almost gentle, like she was used to asking quietly for things instead of assuming she deserved them. But the man didn't hear her voice. He only heard his assumptions. He looked at her backpack again, and then at her hands. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist to him. He let out a small laugh. Not a loud one, but enough to show what he was thinking. "You want to practice? On this piano?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. She nodded without losing her polite expression. "If that's all right." The man leaned back slightly, giving her a long look from head to toe, trying to make sense of her request. Then he smirked and shook his head lightly. "Pianos aren't for everyone," he said, his tone clearly carrying judgment. "It's a bit tough if you're new." He waited for her to react, maybe get embarrassed or step back. But she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just stood there with a calm face and said, "I just want a few minutes." "I won't take long." Her simple answer confused him. He expected her to walk away, not insist. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. A few students nearby had begun to notice the strange conversation. They didn't say anything, but they looked up from their instruments, curious about what was happening. The man finally shrugged dramatically and stood up from the piano bench. "Fine," he said. "Play if you want. But don't blame me if it sounds rough." He took a step to the side and gestured toward the bench with an exaggerated motion. As if doing her a huge favor, she didn't respond to his tone. Instead, she whispered a polite, "Thank you," and sat down. She placed her backpack gently on the floor beside her and took a quiet breath. She didn't rush. She didn't seem nervous. She acted like someone who had done this many times, someone who knew exactly what they were here for, but the man still didn't understand. To him, she looked too ordinary to surprise anyone. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, expecting nothing more than a series of random notes or slow, hesitant playing. He had already made up his mind about her, and nothing in the world could change that, at least. That's what he thought. As she settled on the bench. She adjusted the seat ever so slightly, pushing it forward with her feet. Then she placed her hands gently on the keys, her posture natural and relaxed. Her fingers hovered with the kind of ease only someone experienced could have, though the man didn't notice. He was too busy judging her simple appearance. The room had become quiet during this moment. People practicing nearby began to slow down, unsure why they felt the need to look in her direction. Maybe it was the sudden stillness around the piano. Maybe it was the contrast between her quiet presence and the man's noisy confidence minutes earlier. Whatever the reason, small hints of curiosity filled the air. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if she was letting all the noise around her fade away. She seemed to be gathering something inside her: courage, focus, or maybe just a memory of a piece she had played hundreds of times before. The man let out a silent sigh. Already convinced he was wasting his time watching her, he didn't know that in just a few seconds, his entire opinion was about to change. The girl took one more breath, and without any hesitation, she pressed a single key, one note. Just one, but the sound that came out wasn't the sound of a beginner or someone unsure of the piano. The note was warm, controlled, steady, and full of emotion. It carried something deep, something that made people look up instantly. It wasn't loud, but it had a presence that filled the room gently. Like a soft light in a dark space, even the man felt something shift inside him, though he didn't want to admit it. His smirk faded slightly. He didn't expect that. Not even a little. The girl didn't rush to play the next note. She let the first one ring for a moment, as if letting the room absorb it. Her face didn't change, but something about her expression showed she wasn't playing to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just playing. The man uncrossed his arms slowly, unsure why he suddenly felt the need to stand straight. Something about that one note made him realize he might have judged too fast. Maybe much too fast. And that was only the beginning. The sound of that first note still hung in the air when she placed her fingers softly on the keys again. The man standing near the wall didn't move. His earlier confidence had dissolved into confusion, and he couldn't understand why he suddenly felt a little uneasy. He had been so sure she couldn't play, so sure she'd struggle. But the sound he had just heard told a completely different story. The room stayed strangely quiet. A few people who had been practicing nearby were now pretending to fix their sheet music or tune their instruments, but really they were waiting to see what she would do next. Even the soft hum from the ceiling fans seemed quieter, like everything in the hall was taking a moment to focus on her. She didn't rush herself. She sat with a calmness that didn't look forced or dramatic. It was natural, almost peaceful, as if the piano was a place she knew very well, maybe better than anything else in her life. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, and when she finally played the next notes, it was so smooth and gentle that it felt like a small wave washing over the room. The man blinked. He couldn't believe it. A moment ago, he had judged her without thinking twice. Now he was standing there, trying to pretend he had expected this all along. But even he knew that wasn't true. She continued playing, and something about her touch made the piano sound different. It wasn't loud or showy. It wasn't rushed or messy. It was controlled, thoughtful, almost like she was telling a story without using any words. Every note connected to the next one so beautifully that even those who didn't know much about music could feel something special in it. One student, sitting at the far end of the hall, lowered her violin and listened. Another student stopped adjusting his drum stand. Slowly, people around the room began turning their heads toward the piano. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody even wanted to breathe too loudly. Meanwhile, the man was struggling to understand what he was seeing. He had felt so proud of himself earlier, playing loudly and confidently, hoping people would notice him. But this girl, with her quiet nature and worn-out backpack, was getting more attention with just a few notes than he had gotten with entire songs, and she wasn't even trying. She didn't look around to see if people were watching. She didn't sit with a proud posture or try to make her playing dramatic. She simply let the music flow through her, as if the piano was a friend she had known for years. There was something deeply human about the way she played. Something honest. Something real. The man felt a sting of embarrassment, but he didn't know how to deal with it. A part of him wanted to walk out of the room and pretend he didn't care. Another part of him wanted to get closer just to make sure what he was hearing was actually real. But he didn't move. He stayed frozen, watching, listening, and feeling more humbled with every passing second. After a while, the girl paused for just a moment. Not because she made a mistake, but because the piece she was playing had a soft break in the middle. Her fingers hovered above the keys again, waiting for the right moment to continue. And the room waited with her. It was strange how someone so quiet could hold so many people in the palm of her hand without even trying. But that's exactly what was happening. She took a tiny breath and continued. The melody slowly grew warmer, richer, as if she was peeling back layers of emotion she had kept hidden for a long time. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was simple, yet powerful enough to touch anyone listening. The man's eyes softened. He couldn't deny what he was hearing anymore. She wasn't just good. She was talented in a way that didn't need fancy performances or loud applause. Her talent came from something deeper, something built with patience and years of quiet practice. Something he had failed to see the moment she walked through the door. He remembered how he had laughed at her earlier. How he had told her the piano wasn't for everyone. The memory made his ears burn with embarrassment. He didn't know why he had said that. Maybe because he was used to being the most confident one in the room. Maybe because he never imagined someone who looked so quiet could play with such skill. Whatever the reason, he now wished he had kept his mouth shut. As she continued playing, he noticed details he hadn't paid attention to before. The way she leaned slightly toward the piano, as if listening closely to every sound it made. The way her fingers glided effortlessly across the keys, never forcing a note, never hesitating. The way her expression stayed calm, focused, but full of something gentle. The room, once filled with scattered sounds of practice, had turned into a place of stillness. Even people outside the hall slowed their steps as they passed by the door, curious about the music floating out. Minutes passed, but nobody felt the time moving. The melody was soft enough to soothe anyone who was tired, yet rich enough to make even the busiest mind pause. Eventually she reached the final part of the piece. Her hands moved with a bit more emotion now, as if the music was gathering everything it had been building toward. The notes were warm, almost comforting. She didn't rush the ending. She let each sound spread across the room before letting her hands finally rest on her lap. For a moment, there was complete silence. Nobody clapped. Nobody whispered. Nobody even shifted in their seat. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that follows something unexpectedly beautiful. The kind that made people feel they needed a second to come back to the real world. The girl looked down at her hands for a moment. She didn't seem proud or excited. She didn't even seem aware of the attention she had just received. She was simply calm, as if playing had been something personal. Something she needed to do for herself rather than for anyone else. The man finally found the courage to step forward. He didn't know what to say, and even if he did, he wasn't sure the words would come out right. His earlier confidence was nowhere to be found. All he felt now was a mix of respect, surprise, and a little bit of shame. He walked up slowly, stopping a few steps behind her. His heart was pounding, not because he was nervous about her reaction, but because he suddenly realized how wrong he had been. Hey, that was... He tried to speak but couldn't find the right words. He cleared his throat and tried again. That was... really good. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, but didn't smile or frown. She simply waited, giving him space to finish what he wanted to say. He scratched the back of his neck. I didn't expect... He paused again, feeling awkward. You're amazing. I didn't think someone could play like that. He looked down, embarrassed by his own honesty, but she wasn't thinking about his earlier attitude. She wasn't thinking about the way he had smirked or doubted her. When she spoke, her voice was just as calm as before. I just like playing, she said softly. I've been practicing for a long time. Her answer was simple, but something about it touched the man. He realized she wasn't interested in showing off or proving anyone wrong. She didn't care about competition or attention. She played because she loved it, and that was something he had forgotten. While he had been busy performing for the room, she had been playing for the music itself. Before he could respond, a soft sound came from behind them. The students who had been watching finally let out small breaths, as if they had been holding them the whole time. A few of them exchanged looks, amazed by what they had witnessed. One whispered something about her playing being the best, thing they had heard all week. The girl didn't react to their attention. She only reached down for her backpack and gently placed it on her shoulder. She stood up quietly, ready to leave the piano bench for the next person, but as she started walking away, the man felt something heavy in his heart. He knew this moment had changed something in him forever, and he also knew this was only the beginning of what she was capable of. The room was still filled with the quiet echo of her music long after her hands had left the keys. Even though she had finished playing, the atmosphere didn't return to normal right away. It felt like everyone needed a moment to adjust, as if they had all been holding on to something without realizing it. The man who had doubted her stood nearby, frozen in a mix of confusion and amazement. He kept replaying the sound of that single note in his head. The one that had changed everything for him. She remained seated at the piano for a few more seconds, not doing anything dramatic, just resting her hands on her lap. She looked down, almost as if she was thinking about something far away. There was no pride in her face, no excitement, no expectation of applause. It seemed like she had simply allowed a part of herself to speak through the music. And now she was letting the silence settle. A few students in the hall glanced at each other, unsure if they should say something or stay quiet. Nobody wanted to break the moment too quickly. The room felt warm in a strange way, as if her music had filled it with something gentle that everyone still felt in their chest. The man finally took a small step forward. He didn't know what he was going to say. He wasn't even sure his voice would come out steady. But the need to speak to her, to understand her, pushed him forward. She sensed someone move and turned her head slightly, giving him the smallest acknowledgement. I didn't expect that, he said quietly, almost whispering. As if speaking too loudly would disturb something fragile, she didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a moment, her expression calm and unreadable. Then she nodded just once, as if saying she had heard him but didn't need to say more. She reached down to adjust the strap of her backpack. But to her surprise, the man lifted his hand a little, as if wanting her to wait, not because he wanted to stop her from leaving, but because he wasn't ready to pretend everything was normal again. He had been wrong about her, so wrong, and he felt the weight of that mistake more with every second that passed. Can you play another one? He asked softly. She blinked, surprised. The request hadn't crossed her mind. She had played because she needed to, not because she wanted to show anything. She didn't crave attention. She didn't perform for praise. But the sincerity in his voice made her pause. She studied his face for a moment. His expression had none of the earlier smugness, none of the judgment. He looked almost vulnerable, like he had just realized something important and didn't know how to express it. She didn't give him an answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the piano, placed her hands on the keys again, and let them rest there. The room grew quiet once more, with everyone waiting to see what she would do. She took a slow breath, her shoulders rising slightly, then falling back into a relaxed state. When her fingers moved again, they started with a soft, gentle pattern, repeating like a heartbeat. The notes weren't loud, but they were full of emotion, warm, steady, almost comforting. It sounded like she was telling another story, this time even more personal than before. The man felt something shift inside him the moment she began. It wasn't just admiration now. It was realization of how deeply she felt the music, how naturally it flowed from her, and how blind he had been not to see it earlier. He watched her play, his eyes following every movement of her hands, noticing all the details he had ignored before. The way her fingers curled slightly when hitting softer notes, the faint lift in her wrist before transitions, the small, focused frown that appeared on her face when she played a part that meant something to her. She played differently this time. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because now that the room was listening, she allowed herself to be even more honest with the music. The melody wasn't flashy or impressive in a technical way. It wasn't meant to show off. It was simple, almost like something a child might hum to themselves when they were lost in thought. But that simplicity carried a depth that made everyone in the room feel something they didn't expect as she played. The man felt a strange mix of guilt and admiration swirling in his chest. He had assumed so much about her the moment she walked in. He had judged her before she had even spoken a word. He had believed that talent looked a certain way, acted a certain way, dressed a certain way. But she had shattered that idea completely. He couldn't help but wonder how many times people had underestimated her. How many rooms she had walked into where people looked at her and decided she wasn't worth noticing. And how many times she had responded the same way by letting her music speak for her. The hall had become still again. Even people outside the room slowed down when they heard the soft melody drifting into the hallway. A parent waiting at the entrance leaned closer, wondering who was playing. A young boy holding a small drum paused mid-step, trying to recognize the gentle pattern of the notes. Every second of her playing drew more attention without her even trying. At one point, the man realized he had moved a little closer without thinking. He wasn't the only one. A couple of students whispered softly to each other, saying things like, "Where did she learn?" Or, "How come nobody knows her?" One person said they had never heard the piano sound so alive in the practice hall before, but she wasn't reacting to any of it. She wasn't trying to hold the room's attention. She wasn't performing for an audience. She was simply expressing something through the keys. Something. She didn't need words for as she reached the middle of the piece. The melody softened even more. Her hands slowed, lingering on certain notes as if she wanted to hold on to their warmth a little longer. The man's breath caught for a moment. Something about the way she played made him feel like he was seeing a version of her that nobody else had ever seen. Not the quiet girl with the worn-out bag, not the shy newcomer, but someone who carried a whole world of music inside her. He felt humbled. Truly humbled. Her fingers danced across the keys again, this time with a gentle upward movement, leading the melody into a lighter, almost hopeful section. It felt like a sunrise after a long night. The notes climbed softly, then floated back down, creating a feeling of peace that settled into the room like soft rain. By now, several people had gathered near the door. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared interrupt. It wasn't about politeness, it was because they simply didn't want the music to stop. The man looked at the others, noticing their expressions. Some had soft smiles. Others looked stunned. One older student looked like he might even cry. And the man understood why. Her playing wasn't just beautiful. It was healing in a strange way, gentle, quiet, but full of feeling. Finally, she reached the last part of the piece. Her hands moved slower now, almost as if saying goodbye to each note. The melody sank into a lower, softer tone, like a whisper fading in the wind. And then, with one final gentle chord, she ended the piece. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that came when everyone felt something at the same time. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest on her lap again. She didn't turn around immediately. She just breathed in slowly, then breathed out, grounding herself in the quiet. When she finally stood up, people near the door moved aside. As if making space for her without being asked, the man swallowed hard. He knew he needed to say something. Not because she expected it, but because he owed her acknowledgement, real acknowledgement. Not the half-confused words he said earlier. He stepped forward, his voice soft and honest. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I mean, really wrong." She looked at him, her eyes calm, not angry or proud. "I shouldn't have assumed anything. I didn't even give you a chance to speak. And then you played like..." He paused, struggling to find the right word. "Like someone who carries music in their soul." He finally said. She lowered her gaze for a moment, almost shy, and quietly replied, I just play how I feel. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized, and as she walked past him, the room still quiet and full of her music, he knew one thing clearly. That single note at the start hadn't just proved him wrong, it had changed something inside him forever. The room stayed unusually quiet even after she stepped away from the piano. It was as if her music had left a soft echo behind, one that everyone could still feel even though the last note had faded minutes ago. People had gathered near the doorway, some leaning against the wall, others standing with arms folded. But not a single person moved to break the moment. They all stood there silently, trying to take in what they had just witnessed. The man who had doubted her earlier stood frozen in place. He wanted to speak, but he also knew that rushing her or crowding her would feel wrong. Something inside him had shifted so deeply that he wasn't sure how to act around her anymore. His usual confidence, the loud energy he carried, the need to be noticed, none of it mattered in this moment. Instead, he felt humbled in a quiet way that made him rethink everything he had assumed when she first walked in. She picked up her backpack from the floor, brushing the dust off the bottom corner. The bag still looked simple and worn, nothing special from the outside. But the man now saw it differently, because he understood that what someone carries on the outside has nothing to do with what they carry on the inside. For the first time, he noticed the slight fraying on the straps, the faded color, the tiny tear on the side that had probably been there for years. And instead of seeing a beginner or someone inexperienced, he saw someone who had traveled a long path with quiet strength. She slung the bag over her shoulder, preparing to leave, and walked slowly toward the doorway. People stepped aside respectfully. They didn't say anything, no applause, no loud comments, no questions, just silent acknowledgement. It was the kind of silence that held admiration instead of noise, respect instead of distraction. The man finally moved. He took a few careful steps after her, not too fast, almost like he didn't want to disturb the air around her. When he reached the doorway, she had already stepped into the hallway. The soft echo of her footsteps floated down the corridor. He called out her way, not loudly, just enough for her to hear. Hey, wait a second. She stopped and turned, her expression as calm and gentle as it had been since the moment she arrived. There was no sign of irritation or impatience in her face. She simply looked at him quietly, waiting to hear what he wanted to say. He walked closer until they were standing a few feet apart. The hallway felt empty except for them, even though parents and students were passing by. It was like their small moment stood separate from everything else. I want to say I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out more honestly than he expected. I judged you before I even knew anything about you. Before you played, actually. Before you even spoke. She didn't respond yet. She kept her eyes on him, listening with patience. He took a breath and continued. I thought you couldn't play. I assumed so much. I was wrong. Completely wrong. He shook his head a little as if he still couldn't believe the difference between who he thought she was and who she actually turned out to be. Her face softened. Not with a smile, but with quiet understanding. It's okay, she said gently. People judge quickly sometimes. He let out a breath, almost relieved but still humbled. Maybe, but it doesn't make it right. She nodded lightly. It happens, she said again. I'm used to it. Those words hit him harder than he expected. I'm used to it. It wasn't said in a bitter way. She didn't sound hurt or angry. She said it the way someone might say something as normal as, I came early today, or it might rain later. As if being underestimated was just a regular part of her life. The idea made the man feel even more ashamed. You shouldn't be used to it, he said quietly. People should see you for who you are. She looked down for a moment, then back at him. Not everyone listens, she said. But music listens. That's enough for me. Her words were simple, but they carried a depth that stayed with him. He realized she wasn't someone who needed applause or compliments. She wasn't seeking attention. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just wanted to play, to share something honest. Something human. As they stood there, a few people walked past them, whispering about the music they had heard. Some were amazed, others still stunned. One young student told his friend he wished he could play like that someday. Another said he had never heard anyone make the piano sound that alive. The man watched them pass, then turned back to her. "You know," he said slowly, "I think everyone in that room is going to remember what you did today." She didn't react with excitement. She simply gave a small nod, almost shy. "Maybe," she said. "But that's not why I played." He smiled a little, not because he found anything funny, but because he finally understood. She didn't care about the attention. She cared about the music. And that made her playing even more powerful. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should ask the next question, but it felt important. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. She shifted the strap of her bag and answered in a simple voice. "I practiced at home, most days. Even when things were busy or difficult, the piano was always my quiet place." Something warm spread through his chest. He admired her even more now. He could almost imagine her sitting at an old piano somewhere, practicing alone for hours, not for anyone else, but because the music made her feel alive. He nodded slowly. "It shows," he said. "All of it. The work, the feeling, the years." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to dot after a long pause. She glanced down the hallway. "I should go," she said softly. He nodded. "Yeah, of course." But before she walked away, she did something unexpected. She turned back toward him and said, "Thank you for listening." Her words were small, but they carried more weight than anything he had said. He watched her walk down the hallway, each step gentle and steady until she turned a corner and disappeared from sight. The moment she was gone, the hallway felt different, almost too ordinary after the depth she had left behind. He stood there for a while, staring at the corner she had turned. The music still echoed in his mind, not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. He felt changed, as if she had opened a door inside him he didn't know existed. He went back into the hall, and the room looked completely different now. Not physically, but emotionally. People still stood around, talking quietly about what they had heard. Some students were replaying the last part of her melody in their heads, humming softly. Others were checking the piano keys, as if trying to understand how she had made those sounds. One student walked up to the man and asked, "Who was she?" He shook his head with a small, thoughtful smile. "Someone we underestimated," he said. "Someone who plays from the heart." The student nodded slowly, understanding. The man sat down on the bench where she had been sitting earlier. He placed his hands gently on the keys, feeling the warmth left behind from her playing. When he pressed a note, it sounded normal, just a regular piano note. But it didn't carry the same feeling hers did. It wasn't the piano. It was her touch, her emotion, her years of quiet dedication. He took a deep breath and closed the piano lid slowly, almost respectfully. Then he stood up, knowing this day would stay with him for a very long time. Everyone in that room would move on eventually. They would forget the small details, forget what time it was, forget what day of the week it happened. But they would never forget the moment that girl played one single note that stopped everyone cold. And the man knew something even more important, that one moment had changed him in a way that no lesson, no teacher, no book, and no amount of confidence ever could. He had learned not just about music, but about humility, perception, and the quiet power hidden in people who don't look like they have anything to prove. She had proved him wrong, but more than that, she had opened his eyes, and sometimes one honest note is enough to change everything.